Welcome back, everybody, to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories we love tell us something about who we are. This is the second episode in the conversation that I had with Natalie Rousseau on True Blood. There are 7 seasons of True Blood. So we had quite a long conversation. Natalie and I we just like to get into it. There was a lot to talk about, and I'm sure there is more too. This second half of the conversation is a little bit more focused on the relationships in the episode and what those mean to us. And if you stick around till the end, you will hear the answer to the very important question: Team Bill, Team Eric, or Team Alcide? And the answer was actually something I wasn't expecting. So stay tuned for that towards the very end and enjoy this conversation, part 2 with Natalie Rousseau on True Blood. Here we go.
Yeah, well, if we're talking about female characters, I'd love to also talk about Sookie, because again, I think they're speaking about this kind of like relational dynamics, because Sookie is one of the main characters. She's kind of like there are so many, all the characters are important. I think all the characters in this story are really, really important, but they really portray Sookie as one of the main protagonists. And, she's that like classic nice girl, she's like blonde and kind and all those things. And I feel like she also is a really good example of like the classic empath woman that keeps getting attracted to men that are really not good to her and that are really ambiguous. I mean, one of the first love stories that occurs is her love with the vampire Bill Compton. And it almost seems like this perfect romance. He's this old world vampire, from the time of the Civil War. And he's so romantic and old fashioned in his way. And he wants to, he's cleaning up his act now that True Blood is here and he doesn't need to be violent anymore. And, he's like, there's even a proposal at one point. But then as it comes out, it's like he's not at all who he said he was. And like he actually used her in the most terrible ways. And this almost continually keeps happening, that she keeps having these attractions to often men that are really like supernatural beings, and men in particular that are really, really dangerous for her. And then even when she does have a relationship finally, and you may not be there yet, with one that really loves her, another supernatural being that actually really cares for her, she kind of doesn't love him. She can't really access that same love. So I feel like they really were shining a light on this, again, really common phenomenon where, where people can have these attractions to relationships that are really toxic and distorted. And they become the savior, because that's it. Sookie is continually putting her own life at risk and not showing up for work, not doing the things she needs to do, because she's continually trying to save these vulnerable, dangerous men in her life.
That's so true. I hadn't thought about it that way. But one thing I had thought about, just to speak to her and Bill for a moment, I started watching True Blood shortly after Emily and I had done our podcast on Netflix's You with Joe Goldberg. Which, have you seen that one?
No.
So in that show, Joe Goldberg is, it's not a supernatural show. It's he's a quote unquote regular guy. And he very much ascribes to the exact kind of romance that we see between Bill and Sookie. So he's essentially a serial killer, but he really self-justifies like why he's doing what he's doing. And he has this whole narrative about like, I would kill for her. Like it's something that we hear, I would die for you, I would kill for you. Like we hear these things sometimes spoken in a romantic context, but he means it literally. And it was interesting because in the first like couple of episodes, Bill immediately kills for Sookie. And it's this weird moment where she's like, oh, I don't think that was good. You probably shouldn't have done that, But it's forgiven because he's in this this other realm where he's a vampire, right? And so she can kind of get around that idea that he killed for her because of where he comes from or whatever it is. But he sort of continues to do stuff like that. And that's one of the things, I think they have a few breakups in the show, but that one of the breakups is like, no, like you can't kill people for me, even if it's someone who assaulted me, or even if it's someone who hurt me, like, you can't, that's not actually appropriate behavior, right? And it's funny because you would think that Joe Goldberg in You is essentially trying to be Vampire Bill towards Sookie and wanting to be adored for that. But of course, the women in real life that, when they find out that Joe has killed for him or whatever it is, they're like, that's a red flag. Like, that is a red flag. That means that I'm probably not safe here. If you're going to kill for me, that means you could kill me too, right? And that's true. Like, that's often how it goes when you see violent behavior, even if it starts as like, beating someone up, on your behalf or whatever, like that's the danger gets turned back to the partner very quickly, right? But yeah, I think the whole thing about Bill as the romantic lead, and I was delighted to find out that Anna Paquin and Bill Moyer, those actors, are married in real life, and they have a couple of kids, I think, which is quite sweet. It's like Sookie and Vampire Bill ended up together in real life. Hopefully he's not a killer, and so on. But it is interesting to watch that dynamic happening, just that you were talking about, around an empathetic woman, where a lot of her experience with sexuality, in her case, because she's a telepath, comes from hearing men's thoughts about her body. And so part of the reason she has never had a boyfriend before is because anytime she tries to spend time with a man, she hears these violent thoughts about sexuality coming from them. And she can't, it's like, obviously you wouldn't want to engage with that. And so she's just avoided men. And initially the reason she's so attracted to Bill is because she can't hear his thoughts. And it's such a relief to not be able to hear a vampire's thoughts. And so she's very attracted to vampires, I guess, people whose thoughts she can't hear, because it's sort of like, it's too close, it's too intimate with human men. But part of it is that she's always felt that sexuality can be threatening, right? And one of the other things that I thought was really interesting about this show initially is that it's extreme, right? Like, right away we see a lot of extreme sexuality. And actually, I feel like it tames slightly later in the show. It's like that first season came out with a bang, and it really wanted to be like, this is edgy and this is hot, and like, you can watch the show, there's lots of boobs, and like, there's a ton of nudity and stuff in the show. But as I was watching it, I was kind of thinking too about how, particularly in this show, the sex and the violence are really, really intertwined, which is a truth about our culture. And I think it's a truth about our media. Like, I often think about how it's so common for my 4-year-old to see violence, even cartoon violence. He often says things, he talks about like, I'm going to punch him in the face. And like, this sort of stuff that he learns just from the relatively innocent media that's around him. There is violence in the media he's consuming as a 4-year-old, like children's shows and so on. But there isn't any exposure to consensual sexuality. And, our culture is terrified of sex, including non-violent consensual sex, right? It's like we don't see that very often, right? It's maybe starting to happen a little bit more, but I find it's quite rare actually to see depictions of sex that aren't tied up in violence. And I think especially in that first season, I was thinking about just the puritanical view that maybe we unpack a little bit with the Maenad, right? That, or Maenad, however you pronounce that, sex is ultimately sin, and like, sex is scary and sex is bad and it's violent. And so in Sookie's case in particular, that would have been her experience, right, is seeing sex as tied in with violence.
Yeah, I mean, where my thoughts go is I think the vampire as an archetype has often been an archetype of, the sexual predator, right? And often it is portrayed as like the male vampire and the female victim, and that it plays into this fantasy of being sort of overwhelmed by the, seductive but dangerous male figure, and that there's this hint always of this sexual undertone, even in older stories of the vampires where they weren't explicitly having sex with their victims. It was always there, and then increasingly it has become part of it, and it's definitely made very graphic in this show. I mean, that's part of the story, is that vampires have extremely high libidos and extreme levels of endurance, and just can have sex at like the supernatural level that is like incredible and terrifying, right? And that also, and that's another thing we should probably also speak to, that vampire blood is something that people want to get access to. It is actually a drug. They call it V. And so vampires are sometimes made into victims themselves, where they're held down, because there are ways to subdue vampires, and then their blood is taken from them. And when people consume this blood V, they become like, they first of all go into extremely altered states that are very mystical, kind of like DMT experiences that are shown throughout the show to have negative and positive aspects to it. But they become really extreme addicts often. Like V is highly addictive, and people become very edgy and volatile and reactive, and they become sex fiends. Like they just want to have sex all the time. This show is definitely playing on that theme of vampire as sexual archetype and sexual predator. Yeah, but I think that's really fascinating what you said about Sookie as a telepath, because that is one of the supernatural abilities that she has, is she can hear people's thoughts, and it's quite difficult for her. And in particular, that she can hear what everyone is saying about her all the time, and she's often experienced being an outsider, being strange because of this, and she can hear what the people in her community think of her. But then, yes, most of the men, she hears them having really objectifying thoughts about her body. And so I appreciate what you said there, as her maybe experiencing sex as like this violence or this objectifying experience. And again, it's interesting because there is a character that actually really loves her in the beginning, that when she does read his thoughts, they're always kind and they're always loving, and that's her boss, Sam. But again, she's not attracted to him.
Right.
Like throughout, it kind of shows like she's not attracted to the nice guy that actually really cares about her. She's attracted to these more dangerous characters, but when their thoughts are concealed.
Right.
Which is just kind of interesting to me. It's like, if I don't consciously know that you're thinking those thoughts.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely something there in the thrilling and terrifying aspects of sexuality. And I think there's also something really interesting there about the vampires having vulnerability, which is new, right? I mean, vampire mythology, usually the only way that you can kill a vampire is the wooden stake or cutting their head off or burning maybe. But in this show, we do see vampires as victims many times. And because they have this blood that's so precious to humans as a drug, and also as a healing tool as well, because vampire blood can heal really powerfully in such a way that, there's a little bit of an undertone of like, we can't let people know this, because if they did, we would become slaves to humans, right? And again, that's that tension that keeps coming back around like the history there, and who are we to each other, right? Which is originally, I guess, this racial idea, but then there's so much more that comes through that. And I think there's also something interesting in the blood sucking, like this theme that keeps coming up for me since Nosferatu, and even other stuff that I was looking at before that. It came up for me when I was pregnant and anemic, like the baby had been sucking my blood, right? And so I was losing, because when you're anemic, like when your blood is not rich enough with iron, you become weak, like you become lethargic, and you kind of out of breath, and you're not strong, right? And I feel like there's something for me that I still haven't quite landed on what it is, but it keeps coming back for me around this idea of like the patriarchy sucking my blood, like the idea of the life force being sucked out of me. And so on this show, the fact that vampire blood is valuable to humans, there is a mutual sucking of blood, right? And I sort of liked initially that Bill and Sookie would just sort of trade blood back and forth. Like, he'd suck her blood for his nourishment, but then she'd suck his to like get her energy back or whatever it is, or if she got hurt. And there was there's a real intimacy, I think, that we see also with Hoyt and Jessica, who's another human vampire couple, around like what it means to be sucking each other's blood, the idea that that vampire blood is sacred within the vampire culture. Like there's all this stuff about blood, right, that I find really interesting. And maybe there's just something about right now at this moment in my life of pregnancy and breastfeeding, it's this, you're literally giving your life force to another being. For what, right? From a mothering perspective, that baby is drinking my milk, which is made from blood, now to become bigger and stronger and be able to engage with the rest of the world. Which maybe we don't often think about it this way, but again, that sort of being in relationship with the land is also about food, right? It's also about like what I'm consuming, like the food that I'm eating is becoming my blood and my body and my energy, my life force. And it's one of the ways that I engage with the world. It's one of the ways that as an ex-anorexic, right? It's like when I eat, I'm engaging with the world. When I'm an anorexic, I am refusing the world. I'm isolating myself, right? So there's a lot in here for me, like, mythologically and narratively. And I think there's something specifically around patriarchy and then this idea of like vampires and humans in this show and so on, and like whose blood is empowering whom, right?
Yeah, that was a whole different thing that we've never seen in any other vampire stories that I know of. And yeah, I love all the thoughts that you're having there. But and as a mother, who I know that feeling of like literally having like nourishment taken from my blood and my bones, my essence. And I love this, even tying to like, old Vedic ideas, like everything is food. Everything, like we are food, and we take food, and we become food. Everything is food. But I love also this bigger question you're asking, like whose blood is nourishing whom. There's a lot there. So
because there's power, right? And V is very much gives humans superhuman power, essentially, right? They become so strong. I don't know if they become as strong as a vampire, but there are a few characters who are werewolves that are addicted to V, and they're like unstoppable when they're on V. Like it sounds like, cocaine or something like that. Like they're themselves, but extra, extra, extra. And it's quite dangerous. And it has a hint of that maenad, however you say that, madness, right? It's that moving a little out of control, like having this strength and going out of control with it, which again can be good and bad, right? Like there's one of the ways that Tara escapes her attacker is by drinking his blood so that she can have this strength to escape, even though it kind of freaks her out and she doesn't really want to do that. And so she's sort of repulsed by it. But that's one of the ways that she finds the strength to escape. So it's like any of these things you can use for good or evil, right? And I think the characters in the show do both all the time, right?
All the time. All the time. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, one of the topics I'd love to talk about, and I think you said you're kind of exploring like masculine themes, is something I noticed, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that I feel like many of the male characters in this show were really grappling with like deep-seated shame. Like most of the characters, it's like underlines their struggles, their growth, their stories of the past. I feel like the strongest male characters were like Eric Northman seemed the most like unapologetically like standing in his strength and his power and embracing who he was. And then Lafayette being this beautiful example of like strength and kindness and really navigating the world with a really fierce kind of authenticity that also challenges these traditional masculine norms, being a queer character in the story. And again, I think one of my favorite characters of all, like I want Lafayette. Lafayette has become one of my like internalized, like internal protectors because I was like, oh my goodness, like Lafayette. But yeah, I felt like most of the characters like Jason Stackhouse and Andy and Bill and Sam, like all of them were struggling with this shame, with masculine shame.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I would love to talk about masculinity in this series. I'm on a little bit of a masculinity series right now. I just did a podcast with a friend of mine on the concept of Pedro Pascal as essentially this exceptional masculinity, someone who is able to embody the soft aspects of masculinity, the playful, silly, kind aspects, maybe partly because he plays such intensely violent masculine characters in movies and TV, right? So it's the concept that I've been thinking about is something that I'm not sure if Ruth Whitman came up with this concept, but she calls it impossible masculinity. It's this idea that modern men can't naturally land on what masculinity is and should mean, partly because there's been so much movement from the feminist perspective in terms of like what a woman can be, what a woman can access, what supports a woman has, all of those things. Not that that work is finished by any stretch of the imagination, but there's been a lot of expansion, you know, since let's say the 60s of like what a woman could be. And that's not so much the case for men. And I think a lot of men are really confused right now about what it means to be a man, right? Does it mean protector? Does it mean provider? Does it mean father? Does it mean lone wolf? You know, there are all these archetypes, these masculine archetypes that I think men are having a hard time figuring out what to do with that and where to put that. And there is sort of a hunger for, maybe with the example of Pedro Pascal, extremely masculine men that are protector, providers, and so on, but that are also trans allies, you know, queer, kind, affectionate, loving, you know, all of these things. And it's a really, really difficult line for the everyday man to kind of land on, right? And many years ago, I started attending and then assisting Manology, which is this men's group in Vancouver led by David Hatfield, who I'm hoping to have on the podcast soon, actually. And it was this group of men that could talk about their feelings. And, you know, I've always been a feminist since I sort of knew what that was. But sitting in this room full of men who were being genuinely vulnerable and talking about their confusions and stuff, I realized what an objectified idea I had of men. You know, and how difficult it had been for me to even think that a man could have vulnerability, right, and sensitivity and shame and so on. And so, you know, since then I've been quite interested in, you know, masculinity, what that is, what it means. I have 2 boys that I'm trying to raise, you know, like this is, and it starts young. It starts real young. Like, you know, the gendered conditioning starts really, really early. And so I'm really curious about like, what brings a man into counseling? How available does that feel to them? Like, there's a lot to this story. There are, as you're mentioning it, there are interesting masculine archetypes in the show, right? And we do see these male characters having, I hadn't thought about shame in particular, but I think you're right. There is often like a hiding something. And Jason in particular, I think is such an interesting character because, you know, in the first season, you know, he really is just this kind of this sweet idiot is how he starts out, right? And making a lot of dumb choices. He gets involved in an evangelical church, which is a thinly veiled metaphor, right? It's a church that is the Fellowship of the Sun, I think it's called, where their mission is to just destroy all vampires. And it's one of the places where we see vampires as victims, right? But he gets really involved in this for the sweetest of reasons, you know, like he just is really trying to do what he thinks is right. And then, you know, eventually kind of recognizes that it isn't so much. Jason is always seen in the show as someone who's very, you know, sexy, super high libido, really interested in sex. Everyone wants to have sex with him. He has girl after girl after girl after girl, falls in love with them sometimes, falls out of love with them sometimes. Like he seems like this really surface level jock kind of archetype of a man. But as the show is continuing on, and I don't know how far this kind of goes, but actually he has sexual trauma. A lot of it. It turns out that his first sexual experience was with his teacher. And there's an interesting moment where he re-encounters this teacher and she's like, what I did was wrong. Like she moved away because of this whole thing and whatever. But he's like, no, it's great. Like that was great. I loved it. And then they have sex and it's like this look on his face where he realizes like, oh my God, this is actually not okay. And I didn't even know that this was a trauma for me in my body until this moment, right? In the second season, the My Dad season, there's actually an interesting moment that I really noticed because I don't think you see this that often. In one of the moments of madness, Arlene and Terry, who she's dating at the time, they have sex in their madness thing, but they don't remember it. So they wake up and it appears that maybe they've had sex and they don't remember. And Arlene has this moment of like, did I rape Terry? Like, did I non-consensually have sex with him? And you just so rarely see a woman asking that question, like the sort of idea that a man could be sexually violated, which happens way more than we talk about, way more than we realize, way more than men report, right? Because often it does happen that way, where someone is using a man like Jason to just be like, oh, he's just a sweet idiot, he's just this jock, I can use him for my own purposes without any consequences. But then later, you know, it turns out that that is traumatizing for him, and he starts to realize, like, oh, that's why I'm always using sex as a coping mechanism. And there's sort of quite an extreme part where he's raped repeatedly, actually, by, it's a whole story, but you know, he's really been through it with that, and I really appreciated seeing a little bit of the male perspective on that. I don't know if he's going to be processing it more. Like, you start to see some of it, and I want more of that. I want more of, like, okay, what does this mean for Jason? Where does he take it from here? Like, how does he, I would love to see Jason, like, coming to a different definition of what sex could be for him, right? Like, having an experience where sex is, you know, two people coming together in loving play, right? And, you know, I think so many of us have, you know, maybe small t traumas around, you know, having used sex for status or to feel powerful or whatever it is, for any reason other than I actually want to have this experience with this human being, with my body, in a consensual way that feels safe, right? Like, I think we're in a very sexually dysfunctional culture, and I think many of us are affected by that more than we realize. And so I was kind of thrilled that this show brings it up, not only with Jason, but with other male characters as well. Like, there is a vulnerability there that often we don't see, right?
Yeah, thanks for speaking to all that. I like so deeply appreciated the way they shone a light on, yeah, the vulnerability of men, and actually being like the victim of a woman, in this case, like in Jason's case, like an older woman who groomed him, who was in a position of power. And then later, yeah, he's like actually quite terribly raped, when, you know, in a way where he's you know, he's powerless to protect himself, and this growing realization that his relationship to sex may be more complex than he realized. And it's his characters, again, one of my favorite characters. They're all my favorite characters because his character really does develop over time, and you really see him, yeah, coming to recognize, you know, what love is, what sex is, through these various relationships that he has. And he continues to be this sweet kind of innocent kind of fool at times, but he really develops. And I thought the show was, again, I'm just so struck by the way the show was willing to speak to all these things that we don't often speak to, and I think could address these themes because of the form they used, right? Where it's kind of humorous, and it's kind of silly, and it's supernatural, and it's campy, but, you know, really showing these topics that otherwise, I think if they'd done this in a show that was a drama, it would have been like too much for TV.
Too much, totally.
Like, at that time, especially, right? Like, it's like, no, we're not talking about these things openly quite yet.
Yeah, I so often with this podcast, whatever it is I'm watching, if it's recent, I can also watch TikToks about it or people's Instagram reels or whatever, you know, especially if it's a really big popular show like White Lotus. You know, I can see how people are responding to it. And with True Blood, I don't really have that because it's a bit older, and that wasn't, you know, the standard of how people watched. And so I wonder how that affects things, because, yeah, the show is really able to pull forward these really serious themes. And I don't know if there was backlash about that. I don't know, like, what kind of conversations it created, if any, around this stuff. But it is really interesting to be able to pull forward some of these really difficult, like in the season I'm watching right now, it's a great Buffy style metaphor of the PTSD that Terry and his friend Patrick have from their time in Iraq, like literally, you know, the trauma of war. And we actually learn what that trauma was. And then it's made manifest by this monster, this fire monster, and a curse, and all of these things. And it's just a really sort of perfect way of pulling that through. And I'm not sure, you know, how close the show would have been to the Iraq War, but like, you know, it's right there, you know, like they pull these things from real life and then make it supernatural so that it can make manifest these things. Yes. And in this sort of campy, like, I don't know if we would put True Blood in a horror category. Like, probably we could, but I feel like so much of the time horror is interesting because it's able to do that. It's able to take these cultural anxieties and make them manifest in a way that we can sort of digest and process them, right? Using these metaphors, these stories, these mythologies, right? And it's really powerful to do that because I think the idea that men can be sexually violated, the idea that men have sexual vulnerability, that still feels edgy to me, right? Like that still feels like something people are kind of having a difficult time talking about. There's also a moment where Hoyt, who's like a sweet, quite innocent human character on the show, gets involved with a hate group that target, I think, shifters, maybe all soups. But they have a moment where they're in this room together and they say something like, "You're home now, Hoyt, like you belong with us." And in the interview that I listened to with Ruth Whitman, she had done a lot of research on modern masculinity. And one of the things she did was hang out with incels and just like listen. And one of the things that she found was that these incel communities were one of the only places that men could openly communicate with each other with vulnerability. At a huge cost, at the massive cost of, intense sexism, racism, and so on. But when there is no room for men to have these genuine, vulnerable conversations, when there is no room for men to resolve the shame that so many of them are carrying around, they become vulnerable to essentially these cults, which is true for all of us. It's the cults, will prey on our vulnerabilities. And we see that in the show a few times, I think, including with Marianne and others. But it's like that vulnerability that pulls you into these places. But it was like dead on, it was this moment of like, this is, Hoyt is joining this hate group because he feels misunderstood. He feels unloved. He feels rejected. And there's no one that can understand that. There's no one that he's able to share that with in a way that feels safe. And that's modern, masculinity for a lot of people. I think that these spaces are rare, or if they exist, there's a stigma to joining them, right? There's a stigma to being willing to show up in a men's group and say, like, I have problems in my relationship, or I feel sad sometimes, or lonely, or whatever it is. I think so many of the men that I know will go to women for those things, but not necessarily to each other, like if they'll talk to anyone, right? And so, there's an edginess to even being a feminist saying I'm worried about men, or I care about men, or I think men's health matters, and so on. And so, it's just sitting right there in this show from quite a few years ago that's just doing this like campy, silly thing, right?
Yeah, I love that you're naming that, because I think this show does, again, show the vulnerability of men in modern America, especially when they feel disempowered or they're struggling with deep-seated experiences of unworthiness or internal shame. And then often they don't have anywhere to go but these places where they then are embraced with these dangerous ideologies, right? The fact that this show was naming that at that time, because it always has been, I think, and continues to be a true problem and a concern. And it does give us a lot to think about as a culture. Where are these spaces for men in particular? To be able to work with and work through those feelings that they're experiencing of complex experiences of disempowerment or shame or unworthiness. I really appreciated the show, and I also have wondered that because I didn't watch the show when it originally came out. I just watched it this year too, and I just went kind of nuts. I just binge watched the entire 7 series. I was so fascinated by it and so in love with it, because I've always loved the vampire archetype, but I loved how much depth I thought this show had in such a fun way of showing it. And yes, it's definitely violent and there's definitely horror themes in it. I've also been really curious. I mean, obviously it was well received because it went on for 7 series, right? But I've also wondered, like, what type of conversations was it spurring at that time? Because I feel there's so much here. Like I feel like I just want to write tons of essays on this show. Like I could just take any of these characters and any of their character arcs, and just there's so much to explore there from a social perspective, and from a psychological perspective. from a relational perspective. There's really a lot here. Yeah.
Hey, it's Julie. Quick pause to the conversation. I want to tell you about my new book, Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone, and it has a sequel coming out later this year called Witch, Healer, Priestess, Outcast. These books are stories of the divine feminine, and they're storytelling in a way that helps us to understand our modern lives. So before there was pop culture, there was mythology, right? Those were the stories that we used to understand our culture and to share cultural beliefs and so on. We've got Inanna, we've got Persephone and Demeter, we've got the Baba Yaga from Ukraine, we've got Dumavati, who is this goddess of despair from the tantric tradition. So please go and check out these books, Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone. If you like that one, pre-order Witch, Healer, Priestess, Outcast. You can find them anywhere books are sold. And if you want to be extra helpful once you've got the book, go ahead and leave a review. And I deeply, deeply appreciate that. And I deeply, deeply appreciate you. Thank you. Back to the conversation. So much trauma, awareness of trauma, and the things that we have to do to survive, I feel like is a theme that comes up again and again.
Yeah.
Just thinking about Sam, and that concept of shame. Like, as you say that, I'm sort of going through each of the characters. I'm like, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. There's shame in each of these places, and Sam in particular, and several of the characters, they come from really difficult beginnings, and so they've had to do bad things, to quote from the theme song, in order to survive, in order to get to their next place, right? And a lot of them do have this shame about where they come from, their people sometimes, their parents sometimes, their blood sometimes, and the way people see them. I'm also trying to think of like whether the men talk to each other safely. Like, I'm sort of trying to think about, okay, Jason has all this trauma. He talks a little bit about it to Jessica. Yeah. He should be talking to Hoyt, but Hoyt completely rejects Jason when Jason and Jessica get together, because it's this sexual jealousy thing that sort of cuts off their relationship, which is so devastating. Mm-hmm. And I hope, as I continue to watch, they resolve it somehow, because they're best friends. They should be friends again, right? It's like that male friendship piece, mm-hmm. right? And I'm thinking too about the vampires. Like Bill, is an interesting character, and as you say, it starts as this sort of idealized romance, if dangerous, and then it gets quite dark, and he goes to some very dark places, and I don't know how dark it's going to keep going, but Bill keeps doing these things where I'm like, when are you coming back, bro? Like, when are you coming back to the good side? And you actually see Eric more moving into the side of having some moral, thoughts or ethics or whatever it is. But yeah, even the fact of like what it is to become a vampire, like what was the situation that you were in when you were turned, right? Bill was running away from something and needing shelter, and he gets taken in by someone, and that's a moment where actually he's sort of violated by his female maker many times. So there's another way, I guess, we don't necessarily see it sexually, a little bit, I think, but there's a lot of violence between them, and there's a lot of sense of her using him for her purposes and him going along with it initially, and then getting this moral sense and maybe not wanting to do that anymore and having this struggle of getting out of that abusive relationship. So actually it's interesting that that's there as well. And, Eric being turned after seeing his whole family die by this vampire that he later has these interactions with, because vampires can live for a long time. But yeah, I'm sort of trying to think about where's the healing space for all of this stuff, right? Like, do they just kind of continue to devolve into masculine culture, vampire culture, violence culture, hate culture, whatever it is? Like, these are the spaces that they can go to express the tensions of what happened to them, rather than settling into loving community, right? Or like loving relationship where they can, sort of shed the tensions of what they're holding, shed the pressures of day-to-day life, as much as it should be that. That's not the culture we live in, Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this show absolutely showed that. Like you said, there is an absolute dearth of safe spaces and actual safe relationships. They're all throughout, with even the vampires with each other. The vampires don't trust each other. Definitely you don't really see any relationships where men are truly opening up or supporting each other. Terry a little bit more, I feel like Terry, especially as he comes into loving relationship with Arlene and, starts to get a handle on his PTSD, you see a little bit more of that like open-hearted self and in the way that he relates to some of the other male characters. But it's, yeah, I think it's showing that the lack of safety and the amount of violence that is in the culture.
I think Terry is maybe a pretty good example of positive masculinity, actually,
Hmm.
as someone who is very aware of his PTSD and
Hmm.
psychosis and so on, and that he takes his medications and he does heal to a degree, and then he goes into loving relationship with Arlene. And in the season I'm watching now, which I haven't finished, he's engaging, like this stuff is coming up, right? Like he's engaging with it. And one of his responses is to run away from his family, rather than stay and work this out, which is the metaphor. I'm going to remove myself from the family, which is, fathers can, sometimes that's what happens, right? It's like the pressures get too much. And instead of staying and working it out, fathers leave, like for the sake of the family or whatever it is. And that leaving can be death by suicide. Like sometimes that's the narrative that some people have, is this, my family or whoever it is would be better off without me, so I'm going to remove myself. And we know that the rates of suicide for men and boys is astronomically higher than it is for women and girls, right? So, maybe there's something to that. There's actually a sweet moment too where Terry helps Andy with his V addiction in this really specific way, where he brings him back to like a childhood treehouse, and they like really hash it out. Like maybe that's a moment of like masculine connection between those two. That's really powerful. And Sam is also maybe an interesting example of masculinity. Like there's actually, in one of the seasons, he struggles a little bit with being seen as the nice guy, because people trust him and they take things from him and whatever. And he actually has this sort of masculine identity crisis where he's like, you should be afraid of me, like people should be afraid of me, and he sort of goes off on this thing that ultimately disconnects him from the people around him. And I think he kind of comes back around to being a trustworthy, kind person. But it is actually a bit of a crisis of masculinity in that moment, because he doesn't like being seen as the nice guy. And he's like, hey, don't forget, I had a past where I was a real jerk. And like, you should know that I'm a jerk too. Don't think I'm a nice person, because that's not masculine enough, right? Yeah. So there's one more piece that I thought, there's more than one more piece. Let me tell you, there's lots of pieces here, but I also think, another place the vampire as metaphor that I thought was interesting was in trans and queer bodies, right? There's a moment specifically with Jessica where she says something like, I'm not even a girl. Right. And there is sometimes this conversation around like meeting someone and not knowing whether or not they're a vampire. And then you see their teeth or something comes out, or they say like, I'll have a true blood, please. And it's like, oh, like you're that, like your body is different in a way that is not visible to me from the outside. But if we become intimate, like that would actually be something I would have to get to know. And so I feel like Hoyt and Jessica were kind of an interesting example initially of what a trans relationship might look like, someone who's kind of like, I don't know, I could be open to that, and like maybe that would be interesting. And then they get to know each other, and at first she's really like ashamed and embarrassed by her body and how her body is different, and how she sheds blood as tears now, and she's embarrassed by all of these things. And Hoyt initially is so loving about it, and he's like, this is just who you are, like it's okay that your body is like this, and I love you for who you are, and so on. And then their relationship goes in a whole totally different direction. But I feel like there's also a way that the mainstreaming vampire who's coming into the regular culture, coming out of the coffin, coming out of the closet sort of thing, like there's some interesting stuff too about the trans body and the vampire body that I thought was kind of interesting to think about as well.
Yeah, I definitely think, again, what really struck me was just this way of speaking to different, like minority groups or marginalized groups, whether it was class or sexuality or gender, all throughout the story. And I like that there were lots of positive expressions of queer relationships in this show,
Yeah.
right? For that time, which was still newer, I think, to really see these like really positive queer relationships, because there's multiple queer characters in the show, and it's quite common, it seems, for there to be queer relationships within the vampire communities. But then you also see it with Lafayette and his lover, his partner. So it was just I deeply appreciated that, but there is definitely a theme they're playing on there with this coming out of the closet, yeah, and what that means, and then what it means for, yeah, someone who is vampire to be with someone who's non-vampire, and the learning curve that exists there, and the internalized shame that exists.
And I'd be curious too, again, about people's response to this, like, if any. I don't really know how people were thinking about this, but right now we have such a moment of trans terror, right? Like, I think certain people being terrified of a trans body and what that means, and like, oh, that these trans people are going to turn my child, right? As if that would be possible, right? But that's how the narrative goes in the show, right? It's sort of like the idea that these vampires are dangerous because they're just going to turn you or they're going to destroy you or whatever it is. And that's often how it feels like the right sees trans people who are just trying to live their effing lives. Like, they're just trying to exist. You know, they're not interested in you, right? But that's the fear. It's like the fear of otherness, fear of a body that's different, and fear of that meaning. Maybe part of what the show plays with is like, the idea that that otherness is more powerful than me, right? The idea that that otherness could take away my power and privilege. And so I'm going to fight against it. And, you know, you think about like the guy at the monster killing store who just has like sells thousands of wooden bullets every day or whatever it is. So these people who are just terrified of these other bodies. And the reality within the concept of the show is, yes, vampires are faster and physically stronger, and they have vulnerabilities to humans, for sure. And there is, again, this ongoing conversation of like, are they food? Are they friend? You know, there's this whole conversation about if we have to mainstream with human beings, because if we don't, they will turn us into slaves, right? They will use us for our blood and all of these things, and they're vulnerable to silver and so on within the concept of the universe of the show. So, you know, yeah, I think there's something there about like, it's so relevant to the way that conversation is happening now about trans bodies in particular, I think.
I love that. I love the way you're speaking to this. I hadn't totally seen it that way, but I'm really appreciating this. And also that part of their desire to mainstream was so that they could have equal rights, so that they could actually own property, so that they could pass on their property to their progeny, so that they could, you know, they basically just have the rights of that humans do, which has been so much of the queer movements as well, right? To just be like, I'm allowed to marry, I'm allowed to own things, I'm allowed to be here, I'm allowed to exist. So yeah, I'm so impressed by this show, honestly.
Yeah.
I deeply appreciate it, and it was so fun for me that they spoke to all these rich topics through a supernatural lens, because I'm a sucker for a vampire show.
Same. Literally, pun intended.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a last question for you. Team Bill, Eric, or Alcide?
Oh, I love this. I think Eric all the way.
Same.
Yeah, I just loved Eric, and I loved the way his character developed, and we got to see the fullness of him, right? Because there's that part in the show where the witch basically takes his power and his like memories from him, and he forgets that he's such like a cold-hearted killer, and he becomes this real lover, and him and Sookie have a love affair, and I just like, oh my goodness, I just like fell in love with him. And then throughout I felt that he was one of the characters that continually kind of had more of like this moral compass, whereas Bill devolved. So you're like, oh wow, like what, who even are you? I don't even know you anymore. But then of course it's like fascinating to me, and what is this saying about me that I didn't say Alcide, because Alcide is nothing but a good guy. Like he's everything that you would think you would want, you know, like he's just like, he's strong, he's beautiful, he's caring, he's kind, he's loyal, you know, like he's all of that. But I don't know, I just was captivated by Eric.
And let's notice, I didn't even put Sam on the list. So I'm thinking
Right?
about, you know, like this conversation about masculinity. And,
Yeah.
you know, that story of Sookie as this empath who's sort of attracted to these dangerous men or whatever, like, maybe you and I have that too. Like, that's relatable. Like, I relate to that, right? And this idea that Eric is so appealing because he starts out as this incredibly masculine, incredibly violent, you know, traditionally masculine in some of those negative ways. But then as we get to know him, we find that heart of gold. And that's so irresistible to me, maybe. Like, I mean, I don't know if all or most women or people attracted to men like have this thing, but there is something about like the heart of gold with the bad boy that maybe speaks to our attachment issues, or like, why is that, right, that we see it that way. And I agree from the sense that like we're not so into Bill with the devolution that's happening in the show, and as Eric becomes more morally oriented and more intelligent and so on, like he's this quiet presence that starts to be more and more attractive. But yeah, Alcide is, I mean, physically gorgeous. Like, that is a beautiful actor, that guy. You know, and Sam is interesting too. I mean, he's a lover and he's this complex character and all of these things. And so, yeah, why is it not Alcide or Sam for us, right? Like, why are we not seeing these, not that they're simple characters, but they're more like clearly sort of classically good guys, right? Yeah. So maybe that speaks to some of the many ways that we internalize this stuff too, right?
Oh gosh, revealed on Popcorn Therapy. I'm so embarrassed by myself. Yes.
I feel like it's no secret for me.
Oh no, me neither. But oh gosh.
Yeah. But it's not news, right? That this is the way that we might go.
I love that you asked that. That's fascinating.
I wasn't expecting such a profound answer, but there we go.
Yeah,
but it can be Eric. We can be Team Eric, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Natalie. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate, as always, your thoughts on this stuff. It's just so fun to like just take a bite and chew on it, right?
Yeah, same. You brought up so many great things that I hadn't thought about that I'm really going to chew on, and I really appreciate this. And I love that you were just a yes. I'm like, what about True Blood? And you're just like, I'm doing it.
Anytime.
Yeah,
shoot me an email. Tell me what I should watch, and I'll.
Same here.
Yeah, we'll do
Same
it.
Here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Popcorn Therapy with me, Julie Peters. My guest today was the wonderful Natalie Rousseau. Please go and check out the archive of episodes for Popcorn Therapy. There are lots of TV shows and movies, some concepts in there, things that you might just want to think a little bit more deeply about and kind of join us in that conversation. So go back and listen. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, all of those things. You can also give me a quick rating, a star rating, just a click, a review if you want to as well. All of those things just help bump up the show in the algorithm and get the show in front of more people. Your listening is already a support, but if you want to tip me, if you want to throw a couple dollars to the show, which is just me just doing the whole thing myself with my wonderful guests, you can send me a couple dollars, a donation tip at juliepeters.ca/tipme. It'll take you to PayPal. You can put in whatever amount you want, but if you do want to send $50 or above, I will send you a personalized tarot reading. And if you have a specific question, you can let me know what that question is and I'll read for you based on that. So feel free to do that if you'd like to. Thank you so much to those of you that have already donated. I really appreciate your support of the show. And stay tuned. We've got more. There's more coming. There's always stuff I want to talk about. So thanks as always for listening, and catch up with you next time.